Right now, men across the world are quietly reaching the same realization, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The most unsettling realization for a man is not that he was lied to by others, but that he participated willingly in a collective illusion for years without questioning it. Not because he was unintelligent, but because the illusion was socially enforced, emotionally rewarded, and framed as moral truth. When that illusion collapses, it doesn't shatter loudly. It dissolves quietly, leaving behind a disorientation that feels less like anger and more like sobriety. What men are experiencing now is not outrage. It is the psychological clarity that emerges when repeated patterns finally overpower conditioning. For a long time, men were told that relational failure was primarily a personal defect. If things collapsed, it meant he was inattentive, emotionally stunted, insufficiently evolved, or secretly dangerous. This explanation was comforting to the system because it kept responsibility localized and guilt individualized. A man who internalizes blame does not examine patterns. He examines himself endlessly. He self-corrects into exhaustion. He over-accommodates. He learns to apologize for instincts he does not fully understand, but has been told are primitive, toxic, or obsolete. The illusion required his silence, and for a while, silence was rewarded with the promise of eventual acceptance. What disrupted this was not ideology, but exposure. Men began watching the same behaviors repeat across different women, different cities, different cultures, with such consistency that coincidence became statistically impossible. The contradiction between rhetoric and behavior became too visible to ignore. Independence paired with expectation of provision, empowerment paired with avoidance of accountability, infinite standards paired with minimal self-reflection. These were not isolated traits. They were patterns reinforced socially and excused morally. Once a man notices patterns, the spell breaks. He stops personalizing what was never personal. The flawed belief that began collapsing first was the idea that desire is negotiated through effort alone, that if a man gives enough patience, emotional labor, resources, and tolerance, stability will emerge naturally. Reality contradicted this repeatedly. Many men discovered that the more they contorted themselves to meet shifting expectations, the more contempt quietly replaced attraction. Effort did not create security. It created leverage for further demands. This realization was destabilizing because it inverted the moral narrative. The behaviors men were praised for did not lead to the outcomes they were promised. Beneath this contradiction lies a mechanism rarely discussed openly because it undermines comforting narratives. Attraction is not governed by fairness, nor sustained by sacrifice. It responds to internal orientation. A man who is centered, internally complete, and non-negotiable in his self-respect generates a psychological gravity that cannot be faked through performance. When a man abandons that center to be agreeable, endlessly available, or emotionally absorbent, he communicates something more powerful than words. He communicates that his sense of self is contingent. Contingency erodes desire. This is not cruelty, it is biology intersecting with perception. Modern social structures, however, rewarded the opposite behavior in women. Emotional volatility was reframed as depth. Entitlement was reframed as self-worth. Avoidance of responsibility was reframed as trauma. Over time, this produced a mismatch between expectation and reality. Many women were taught to expect outcomes traditionally associated with reciprocal partnership, while being actively discouraged from offering reciprocity itself. Men noticed that dissatisfaction persisted regardless of what was provided. No amount of accommodation stabilized someone whose identity was built on perpetual grievance. The lived reality exposed another uncomfortable truth. Chaos was not an accident. For some, it was necessary. Emotional turbulence provided stimulation, validation, and narrative leverage. Stability felt empty because it offered no conflict to mine for identity. Men observed that peace was often interpreted as neglect, consistency as boredom, and boundaries as threat. When chaos is internalized as vitality, any partner offering calm becomes expendable. This is why many men found themselves punished not for neglect, but for sufficiency. As social documentation increased, the gap between accusation and reality became undeniable. Recordings showed calm men labelled aggressive, boundaries labelled control, withdrawal labelled abandonment. Language designed for healing was repurposed as a weapon to avoid introspection. Once this was visible, men stopped debating intentions and began evaluating outcomes. They stopped arguing semantics and started tracking patterns. The realization was sobering. Emotional narratives were often detached from objective behavior, yet carried disproportionate moral authority. Another belief dissolved quietly alongside this one: the assumption that empathy is reciprocated by default. Men learned, often painfully, that their vulnerability was not inherently protected. In many cases, it was archived, reframed, and later used as ammunition. This created a behavioral shift. Men did not become colder, they became more selective about exposure. Emotional openness without trust is not intimacy, it is risk. Once that distinction is internalized, performative vulnerability loses its appeal. Social reinforcement amplified the problem. Group dynamics rewarded escalation over resolution. Accountability was treated as betrayal. Self-critique was reframed as internalized oppression. In these echo chambers, dissatisfaction became a badge of sophistication. Men who observed this learned something critical. When someone is surrounded by voices that validate every impulse, growth becomes impossible. No relationship can survive that environment because there is no internal friction to interrupt destructive behavior. Over time, men also noticed the commodification of connection. Romance reframed as transaction, attention as currency, validation as income. When intimacy becomes performative and externalized, trust erodes. Men began to see that some interactions were not relational at all, but extractive. Resources flowed one direction, emotional labor flowed one direction, accountability flowed nowhere. This was not partnership, it was consumption with a romantic aesthetic. The consequence of this recognition was not hatred, but withdrawal. Men stopped arguing, they stopped explaining, they stopped attempting to be understood by systems that benefited from misunderstanding them. Silence replaced justification. Solitude replaced negotiation. This was not a retreat into bitterness, but into coherence. Many discovered that peace was not something they needed to earn. It was something they had surrendered gradually without noticing. The narrative that men fear commitment began to sound hollow in this context. What men were avoiding was not intimacy, but asymmetry. They were not rejecting connection, but conflict without resolution. The risk calculus shifted. When the potential cost of choosing poorly includes financial devastation, reputational damage, and prolonged psychological instability, abstention becomes rational, not pathological. Men learn to differentiate loneliness from tranquility. The two are not the same. What emerged was a reorientation toward internal authority. A man who no longer requires validation to feel legitimate becomes difficult to manipulate. He does not argue with distorted narratives because he is not dependent on them. He does not need to be seen as good by systems that profit from his compliance. His standards are quiet, not performative. They are enforced through absence, not confrontation. This is why the shift feels irreversible. Once internal authority is restored, external coercion loses effectiveness. This awakening also revealed collateral damage. Women capable of reciprocity, accountability, and respect now encounter men shaped by prior exposure. Trust is slower, vetting is sharper, patience is finite. They are affected not because they caused the damage, but because they exist in the same ecosystem. This is the cost of normalized dysfunction. It contaminates the entire environment, not just its most visible participants. The broader cultural consequence is already visible. Declining commitment is framed as moral failure rather than adaptive response. Systems prefer to shame men back into participation rather than examine why participation feels unsafe. But reality does not respond to shaming. It responds to incentives and consequences. When effort is punished and boundaries are pathologized, withdrawal is inevitable. The quiet resolution forming in many men is simple and unannounced. If partnership enhances life, it is welcomed. If it destabilizes it, it is declined without apology. This is not ideological, it is experiential. Men are no longer outsourcing their self-worth to relational success. They are no longer confusing endurance with virtue. They are choosing coherence over chaos, even if that choice is misunderstood. The truth men are waking up to is not that women are adversaries. It is that systems that excuse destructive behavior eventually lose participants. Reciprocity is not optional. Accountability is not oppression. Peace is not boring. These are not opinions. They are conditions for sustainability. Relationships that ignore them collapse, regardless of narrative protection. What remains after the illusion dissolves is quieter than expected. There is no victory, no revenge fantasy, no crusade. There is clarity. A man who sees clearly does not need permission to protect his peace. He does not need consensus to withdraw from dynamics that erode him. He does not need to be loud about his standards because his absence communicates them precisely. This is the shift unfolding beneath the noise. Men are not waking up to anger, they are waking up to self-possession. And once a man reclaims that, he does not return it for the promise of acceptance. He builds a life that is internally stable, externally selective, and psychologically intact. If partnership enters that life, it does so as an addition, not a requirement. If it does not, the life remains whole. That is the unsettling part few want to acknowledge. Male fulfillment does not require participation in systems that punish coherence. When men discover this, the leverage disappears. What replaces it is not hostility, but indifference. And indifference is what finally forces reality to respond.